Hi, and welcome to Johnny Random Show. Today's episode, we are going to talk about the political dials. And it's been a long time since we've really been on this topic. I know we did the mythology and we kind of added that dial to the political dials. So now I kind of want to go back and recap all of the dials, especially since it's been almost 2 years since I had the initial concept. And we went through the whole religious dials, the Christian dials project, and we really hashed those out and I think those got those to a really good place. And I kind of wanted both of these to work in tandem, to have them both. So I really need to go back and refresh all of that. So this is kind of a brainstorm slash summary slash recap. I don't know, whatever we'll call it. It's just going to turn out be kind of a hodgepodge, but hopefully if you liked the Christian dials, then you'll like the political dials as far as like see what we're doing here. And then if you liked originally the political dials, I think this is going to be a better breakdown, because I went back and watched it and it's kind of hard to follow. It was a very new idea. I mean, it was literally the first time I had come up with this. So we'll just jump right in here. So the first one is, it's had a lot of different names. Sorry, the names have kind of changed on this, but the concept has really stayed very similar. So, but I'm calling the first one the government dial, okay? And the reason why I changed the name to this is because I think it helps categorize and it kind of mirrors the Christian dials, and where you kind of have started with the church, and so this is kind of the government, right? And so this is very much kind of in the same idea of authority, right? How big or small is the government? How legitimate? How small is it? Should it have one single leader at the top? Should it be broken out into multiple, sort of the federalist model where, a bunch of different jurisdictions, or should there be no government at all and anarchy at the bottom? So that's the kind of range where it's a single person in charge, multiple people, and, broad and spread out, but still big, broad and small, but still multiple people, and then no government at all. So that's kind of your I don't know. I kind of shape it like this, dial of where you're in there. So that's the 1 through 10 on that. And then in the same way, you have the individual dial, right? So draw some parallels just to help you kind of visualize this and understand it, is if your government, there's a lot of government, then you really don't care that much about the rights of the individual or what the responsibilities of the individual is, because you have a single monarch at the top that kind of directs everything in the country, right? But as you go down on those, what is over here is very important. So if you feel like you have no responsibility, the government should not be involved at all, and the individual doesn't have any responsibility back to the government, back to governance, then you would be way down here, right? If you feel like that the individual has every responsibility on what goes on in the government, that person should be voting in every election, that person should, have the right to bear arms, should be very involved in that government and its processes, you're high up here. So this is like individual, like personal engagement, high personal engagement in the governing and how it works. And this would be low government engagement and responsibility, and you see no sense of responsibility or engaging with the government, right? And so just paralleling it back to the Christian dials is like, if you have the church is really high and it dictates everything and how it all works, it doesn't really matter what the rest of the dials are so much. But if you're low on that, it becomes really, really important where over here you are, how engaged you are, right? And I think this is where kind of the founding fathers is kind of like, it's a republic if you can keep it, you know what I mean? If the people stay engaged. So you're basically making a call for having high personal engagement and a smaller government. That would be the thing there. Where anarchy would be at the bottom, and libertarian would be up from that a little bit, but still kind of low on both of those dials. So that's the first two dials, government and individuals. Okay, and then we go to social contract. Okay, and I move this around because I've had these in all different orders, but this is the order that I think that makes most sense, right? So if you have a government, and we have government, right? We have governance, and we have centers of authority. What should be the things that the government does? I call it the basket of in the social contract basket. I don't know why I called that. I think I got it from somewhere I can't remember, and I'd love to attribute it to wherever I got that. But right now, that's what we're calling it. So what goes in that? Should it just be police officers and roads and bridges and public schools and whatever, or should there also be healthcare? Should there be what should be in it? And then so you kind of have at the bottom is basically nothing. The government should not be in charge of any of those things. It should basically only be in charge of maybe securing the border, protection there. Or at the top would be the government owns everything from means of production, property, all those things. So this is like, you're kind of like socialism is the highest point on this. And at the bottom would be, again, anarchy. No, So that's that next dial. Then the one after that would be borders, right? So how open or closed those borders should be, what the process should be, and how many people come in. It's a very easily, I think this is probably the easiest one probably for people to understand. But I do think it makes a big difference on what you think the proper amount of sovereignty that nation should have, right? Should that country just control everything inside it? Should do all the trade inside? If it's protectionist, versus open, free trade, all these different things there. And then the last one is mythology, right? What do the people believe about their past? And this, we've decided, go back and watch the whole mythology episode because it's great. But basically, it's how pessimistic or optimistic you are about the past. That's the gauge, right? And all these are universal principles, right? So this could apply to countries all over the world. They're all going to have their past, their story of how they got there, what their past is. Is it a good past? Is it a bad past? Is it, what's it based on? Is their mythology? And the high end of that is going to be optimistic, more nationalistic, maybe framing of it. And the other would be, the bottom is like a pessimistic sense of, whatever. Whereas, we sketch that out with being colonialism is a common pessimistic past because it frames the past on a injustice, right? We're here because of injustice done, carried out by our forefathers. So, it's a very pessimistic past. So, with all five of these is how you would wherever these levels are, we would say whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you're on the left, you're on the right. So anyway, so that is the dials basically in a nutshell. Dad, fire away. What are your thoughts? Are these good? Did I miss anything as far as explaining? Is it helpful?
Yeah, I thought it was helpful. I just had a couple questions about things.
Okay.
When you're talking about the third dial, the social contract, I thought about fascism because I actually thought that would be higher than socialism, or socialism. But I almost think fascism falls into like the second dial because fascism is one person at the head of the government, and it's a lot of things are nationalized, and so it's like a king, but it's not a king. It's like a chancellor. You think of Hitler becoming a chancellor and then becoming, he's the supreme leader kind of thing. And I just was wondering, what dial would you put that in? Or, if you think about it, maybe you don't have an answer right now, but I was just.
Well, I'll take a stab at it.
Where does that fit in these dials if we think about that, and maybe need to know more about fascism?
Yeah. Well, okay. So every ideology is based on a setting of each of the five dials. So communism and fascism, I would think, would both be very, high on that government or governance dial. You want to have a small group of people, but I would think fascism would want to be even one notch above communism, right? Because communism can exist with a group of people at the top. Fascism usually has to have one person at the top, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not
Yeah,
really familiar with all the nuanced differences between each other, but my understanding is
yeah,
fascism tends to have a cult of personality as being a top down person, where communism is a whole, like, a collective system of people that have a very high top heavy government, right? But
yeah.
fascism tends to be built on that cult of personality. And then also too, borders, while I think communism tends to be open borders, but no, communism tends to be like closed borders, but even socialism is like, fascism is even more so, because fascism is like protectionist, max closed borders, max no one goes in or out. You know what I mean? So I think it's kind of like they're both similar on the dials, but they're just like a fraction apart from each other, maybe.
Hmm.
And then
Yeah,
social contract, socialism and fascism. I think that's where fascism doesn't always have to have own all the means of production, doesn't have to, it might be lower on the social contract aspect, whereas
hmm,
communism, like, that's the whole thing about communism, is that it's a community. It's they owns the means of production, it owns the property, it owns everything, it owns factories, it owns how much wages are, how much the prices are, price controls everything. So I think communism is actually higher than fascism, because fascism
hmm.
can exist maybe lower. So that's where I would split those two ideologies out on the dials. And then mythology, I think that just whoever a fascist or communist leader can capture whatever, use a pessimistic past to get power, or use an optimistic past to get power. I would think fascism tends to use an optimistic past because it's more nationalist. We're the greatest in the world and elect me and whatever. Where communism tends to be based on all the bad things in the world, you know, that, we have to, I don't know,
Yeah.
utopia.
Protect
So
everybody from all the bad,
yeah,
right?
protect everybody from all the bad. Put us in
So
power and trust
yeah,
us,
for
and
any bad thing, all the outcomes got to be the same. Everybody's got to be fair. We're going to be fair. Just we're more fair to some people than other
right.
people. It's the way it works out. But yeah,
And
the
because
other
those,
thing is,
oh, go ahead.
go ahead.
Well, I was just
I
going to
was
say
about
that
to
the
switch gears.
individualism dial is way down in socialism, because you don't want to have much individualism at all, in both of those ideologies, uh, to just touch all of the dials there, all five of them. So, but go ahead.
Okay. The next question I had was on the borders, and I thought of the term citizens' rights, or what, who are citizens, what makes a citizen, what's the process, how exclusive, inclusive is that? Is that the right idea? Does citizenship fall in under borders? Is it borders, the term that you're using, much broader than just citizenship, or is citizenship broader and borders is smaller?
This is a great question. This is a very important question, because I just did a international law class recently, and I feel like we were talking about citizenship, and just something clicked in my brain. Like, wow, that ties back to the dials so perfectly, because in certain countries, the responsibilities of a citizen is different, right? So in and that's where, when that is all, so I think that falls into what the responsibilities of a citizen falls on the individual dial, right? The rights of the individual,
Right,
how
right.
much you participate or not. Borders tends to be, I think, countries that have uh, more responsibilities on the citizen tend to want to have lower, like, policies that have easier entrance, right? More open borders. I don't know if that actually correlates, because I'm having to think about it in the moment. You caught me off guard with a great question, so um, have to spend a little bit more time on that. But that is an interesting question. But I think it touches both of those, right? And it's like with the Christian dials, right? There's lots of topics that we talked about that merged into different things. And when you're talking about one aspect of it, I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head. like eschatology, right? We talk about the future, right? What happens in the end? Well, that also plays into what you think of that. Also, kind of how does the supernatural world work and those types of things, right? Am I actively
Government
involved?
relationship to the government. Yeah.
Yeah, am I actively involved in this means and frequency, on bringing about the end of the world, or is it something that is yeah, so we talked about all those different things and how those kind of play in. This is kind of a similar thing where I think that there's overlap in, but they're each distinct categories that, again, we're talking about ideology here, right? So it's, I always come back to the example of like a car, having those settings, in to listen to a song, right? You might want, you might have a setting that you listen to it because that's the way you were raised, and then you think about an issue and it kind of changes your dials, what you feel comfortable with, on these and over time, you know what I mean? And so and how you feel about that may dictate how you feel about that issue overall, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Those very
Yeah,
vague terms.
certain type of music, you're definitely putting more bass in there.
Right, yeah.
And if you do another kind, you're putting a little more trouble in there.
Right.
So it's that kind of preference type thing of how you want to live your life, huh? With these adjustments in the dial, how you look at the world around you and what should be.
Right. And so in the book, I would go and I would try to build a case for the government. The historical case of is like, okay, so you had chiefs and clans, and it's very one person in charge, but it's very much come and go. And then you have a king where it's one person in charge, but that person is obeyed without question, and then with borders, you kind of have this thing where if you're being attacked or you're in a geographical area, you have to band together, and so there's this, who's on the inside, who's on the outside, sovereignty questions all the way through history. And then we talk about the Treaty of Westphalia, where basically you had people having religious wars over Catholics and Protestants for a long time, 100 years, trying to be like, okay, well, does the king get to decide if we're Anglican or we're Catholic? And should we be fighting, these people? And it was like, okay, well, basically that treaty said, whatever the king is, that's what the country is. That's the official, religion of the country. And that seemed to satisfy, at least on an international level, because the hegemony had broken. The Catholic, was not the only game in town, and so there was the framework for how everything worked had to shift.
How do we do marriage? How do we do funerals? How do we interact with one another? Do we go to, the priest to settle these things? If we have problems with the land, ownership and where the fence ought to be and all of that. And so religion played a part of that day-to-day life. And so it meant a lot.
And I think also too, when I was trying to parallel these, it kind of helped me understand too, is you went from having, the Catholic Church being the predominant view of how things were done to, a big Protestant, the whole Protestant Reformation, and the whole idea of like the priesthood of believers, that you had direct access to, Christ. And then, I think this helps parallel where, okay, now that individual dial, that's where people like John Locke and these people are trying to figure out how to make institutions that are democratic. You know what I mean? And I don't want to overstate it too much, but I think that there's a parallel here somewhere, between these things. And if that goes down, if the government power goes down, and you have this resting in a body of people, well, then the responsibility of the individuals goes up. You know, and he's talking about, okay, so if you're not relying on the church for that, well, now you go to scriptures, you know, and then, but you have that problem of like, how do you interpret scripture? Well, now you have the problem of government of like, okay, people have different ideas on who, you know, how government should go, how borders should go, all these different issues. You know what I mean? Does everybody just get to decide it? And that's I think, I don't want to pair communism to Catholicism because that seems really bad to do. But I think the idea, if you'll allow me to make this analogy, right, is in the Catholic Church, right? There is no, that is the draw of some people that I think deconstruct Christianity, but then come back to Christianity is they go to Orthodoxy or Catholicism because there's this, I go to Mass, I do this, you know, the Hail Marys, I have this process. It feels very much like I'm joining something bigger, a collective. You know what I mean? And I think that that's kind of like the draw in communism too, is kind of like, no, that's not the draw in communism, but I'm trying to say that like the draw of communism is there's like a system, right? There's less accountability on an individual to make all these decisions. There's more trust in government to take care of this, right? That's what we have government for, you know, is to make sure that there's, you know, some level of equality, make sure that the bad people are punished, make sure that, you know, justice is done. And so we, you know, have the government there. I'm trying to make the best steelman argument for, you know, communism, which personally is hard to do, but you know, I think that might be why some people are drawn to ideologies like communism. Let's just say that, you know, more leftist type things.
Yeah. Well, a lot of things happened, you know, historically to change government and the way people looked at things. When you think about the divine right of kings, then suddenly, you know, King John, you know, is this bad dude, and you go like, you know, listen, you know, the leadership gets together and puts a sword to him and say like, would you like to change your mind and do things a little kinder, you know, because we're not, you know, this is getting old, you know, and so you have that mindset that maybe the king can be wrong. And maybe we can have some say in what, you know, is done and what we give our lives for and what we give our, you know, money for. And, you know, we're willing to give you, you know, authority, but, you know, you have to listen to us. And there has to be some accountability there. God may have placed you there, but by God, we're going to hold you accountable.
Right. So you just inspired a thought. So, you know, in my last video, I made a point to talk about how when you know, America being the first, you know, republic or democracy or, you know, experiment, you know, this grand experiment. And then, you know, I talked about kind of like what the original Constitution seems to spell out, you know what I mean? But one thing that I think that because the Constitution was originally, you know, kind of a pushback against kings, and it was a push down to like a democratic republic, right? Or a republic, you know, if you can keep it, you know, is what it was said. And so you push the dial down from like 9 or 10, you know, down to maybe a 7, you know, or a 6 or 7, you know, that's where I think they were trying to make it, you know, and I believe they originally tried to do the, you know, United States. There were several versions of the United States before the Revolutionary War and before the, you know, whatever. And it was very dysfunctional because you had, you know, all these sort of, yeah, the Confederacy?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, isn't that the Southern Confederacy?
No. There was a Confederacy. That's what it was called.
Okay.
Before George Washington, we had 5 to 7 presidents,
right,
who were part of the Confederacy. Before, and that's what George Washington faced, was he couldn't get the things he needed because he was talking to each individual state.
Right.
Send me some men. And they're saying like, no, we got to protect us. You know, I need some money. Well, you know, I could throw in a few crowns here and there, you know, to help you out. And George is like, I'm paying for the whole war myself, and that's what he had to do.
Right.
He paid for the war. He paid
And
his own soldiers.
that's perfect. It's kind of like I knew that history, but it's been so long. So, but
Yeah,
so yeah, so they're like pulling that dial way down and realize that like, okay, we can't go down quite that far. You know, we need to bring it back up to a 6 or 7. You know what I mean? And so,
we need to have a federal government.
yeah, and of course,
Congress.
notoriously they were against factions. You know, which is like the old timey word for political parties. You know, they were not for political parties. So the idea that of all of these other, like we said, the mythology, the borders, the social contract, the rights of the individual, like you're just in the birthing part of like seeing these things being necessitated. You know, we need to have these positions. You immediately have the Federalist and the Democratic Republicans, parties forming right after, after George Washington, and represented by John Adams and was it Madison? Um, I think it's James Madison, where like some of the bigger players. But either way, kind of like forming where it's like, okay, so you have, okay, they both are, in the same place on the government, right? But then it's like the individual dials and then the social contract, right? What do we need to have a standing army? We need to have, people in it. We need to have this defense. What our borders? You have kind of like the Hawks, like we need to go to war over, over here, and then that's going to affect our long-term strategy as a country. And then you had the anti-individualist, interventionist, and so we're lower on that. And so you start forming these things very early in the early days of our country. And then I think as you go out from that, you see, later on, you start having, till you get to the modern Democrats and Republicans, which is something we haven't covered, I guess, yet, is where I would say both Republicans and Democrats are going to be, on a 7 or 8 on the, government dial. On the individual dial, I would say that, the I'm not gonna say I'm gonna say it's split, but I think they're pretty close. At that
Yeah,
7 or 8,
they're pretty close. Yeah,
because I think there's just as many Republicans that don't vote that are low on that dial as there are Democrats that are low on that dial that don't vote, don't necessarily feel a sense of responsibility to governance or to the government, how it should be run. And then the social contract, I think that's where the big split is. I think that as we talked about last time, I think that you have Republicans that want to have a large military and they want to have school funding and teachers getting paid and Social Security. Nobody wants anybody to take away Social Security on either side. I think the Republicans are obviously lower than the Democrats, but I think both of them are still maybe the Democrats are at a 7 and the Republicans are at a 5. But I don't think that anybody is really just for like, well, maybe you could say the Republicans. There's a group of Republicans that are very much on the lower side that are trying to, get rid of the Department of Education, do away with these things, and limit the things that are in the social contract bucket or basket. And then I think that the Democrats are definitely wanting to add healthcare to that basket, but I think it's disingenuous. This is where a lot of our like cultural wars come from. I think it's disingenuous to say that the Republicans are socialists because they want well they're not up there wanting government to own private property or businesses. Both parties are really don't want government in their businesses. Well, this is bringing up some.
They want they want the government in somebody else's business. They don't want it in their business.
Right. Yeah. And well, I think everybody wants. I think that there's a tendency for both sides to want, at the grassroots level, wants to break up the media companies. It's like on the right, and then the left wants to break up the billionaire corporations. And it's like they both have their boogeymans on both sides, and I think they both kind of have the same inclinations there. And then borders. I think, the Democrats and Republicans have different ideas. I mean, it's fairly obvious on open and closed borders. And then mythology, I think the Republicans have more uh, optimistic, and the Democrats have more of the pessimistic thing. And you'll have to go back and watch the mythology episode to get more in depth there. I'm gonna plug that multiple times because I think it was a good episode, but and it's recent, so it's kind of good there. But yeah, I think this has done a good job. Well,
Solid.
let's keep going because I think that that's good. Okay, so we covered what I think the majority of Democrats and Republicans would be. We covered what socialism and fascism would be, and did we cover libertarians? I think they would be low on government. I think they're also low on the individual responsibilities because it's kind of like whether you vote or not doesn't make most libertarians I know like don't vote or don't care about government at all. And don't feel a real. Maybe that's where the NGO and big business kind of comes into. So if you're anti big business, you're going to be lower on this dial. I'm just trying to make sure all these things actually check out. You know what I mean?
I think some libertarians just feel disenfranchised. They are not part of the system because they can't get in.
Right.
We have two parties and that's it. And if you're anything else, you don't get to, you don't get the opportunity to have your candidate in a debate or, different other things. You have a harder time getting on the ballot and
yeah,
getting heard.
It's one of those ideology that's very self-defeating, right? Because it's like, how do you minimize government? Well, you have to have high. You either I don't know. I just thought it's like a conundrum, right? It's like you're either really active in voting for candidates that are for cutting government. You know what I mean? So cutting things in the social contract. I guess that's a modern version of it. It's like cutting things in the social contract. You're high on the individual dial, but you're low on the social contract dial and maybe the low on the government dial. So you want a smaller government with less people in it that does less things on the social contract, but you'd be high on the individual dial because you're still that individualism, Yeah, that makes more sense. I don't know why I said lower on the beginning because I think I was throwing myself off. Yeah. So, and then borders, I think, libertarians could go either way. I think it's funny because it's like you could either be like, well, because government doesn't matter, what borders even matter, and then it's like, well, you could be so libertarian that borders are all that matters. What goes on inside our country should be the only thing that matters.
Well, a lot of them just feel like then that borders, I shouldn't say a lot, at least, one that I know seems to think that it's my property and I can protect my property and there are no borders. Right. There shouldn't be any borders. There shouldn't be any government. That's more the anarchist, type thing. So I think I should be able to protect and say what goes on my property.
I think that dial maybe.
I don't care what you do with your property as long as it doesn't infringe on me,
Right. I think that the borders dial may be the biggest difference because libertarian and anarchist are very close to each other. I think the borders dial is the one that really makes them break whether you're more anarchist or more libertarian, because I think a libertarian would be very important I think a libertarian would be more important, like high on the individualism dial and also high on that borders dial where it's like, okay,
yeah.
And then whereas an anarchist would be more like low on that borders dial because borders don't even matter,
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that makes sense. So we've even explained anarchy with our dials, Every system of government here is represented, and that's what it's like. That's why I like this project, is because it has, I think, a lot of ability to explain things that people don't. In broad strokes, it easily explains what people take whole podcasts to try to describe. Well, I mean this, but I don't mean that, and when people say this, that they think they mean that I mean this, but I really, and so, all that
And if you gave
nuance.
them a tool that they could kind of,
Yeah,
say they're at on these things, it would make far more sense. It gives you a tool to kind of wrap your head around.
yeah. And then there's people like me that don't fit in any of the parties, and it's like but I can find my place on this. You know what I mean?
There's a lot of people, no doubt.
Yeah. So this has been good.
Gives people, individuals, more nuance with it, without saying, well, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Libertarian, I'm anarchist, or whatever, communist, socialist. Well, where do you fit on these things? You may say be a socialist here, but we may agree on some of the other things that are on the dial, and be closer than we would with somebody else. We look at all five. So.
Yeah. This is really good. We need to make this and the Christian Dials into a website where you can answer the questions and get a profile of what your dial settings are. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Dan, and I appreciate it. Let me explain and break down the dials, and I'm really excited that both of these have kind of moved to their ending point, and I have a good idea on what these books are going to look like. So thank you so much, audience, for watching. And we'll see you next time on the Johnny Random Show.